It turns out there's actually scientific basis for not eating or fasting to protect yourself and to actually increase the function of your immune system. Welcome to the Dr. Gundry podcast. There's something you are likely eating every day. It can negatively affect your waistline, complexion, and overall health. And even worse, your immune system too. I'm talking about sugar. Unfortunately, the sweet stuff can lower your body's ability to fight off illness. As a matter of fact, researchers have found that eating any kind of sugar has the potential to reduce your body's defenses by 70% for up to 6 hours after you ingest it. So, during the current crisis, limiting your sugar intake is more important than ever. On this episode of the Dr. Gundry podcast, I'll talk more about the effects sugar has on your body's ability to fight off harmful viruses. I'll also share tips for conquering sugar addiction once and for all, and how you can enjoy sweet foods without eating the enemy. So tune in. This is not an episode you want to miss. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is sugar? Well, sugar comes in so many forms that it's actually incredibly difficult to figure out what you're eating has any sugar. So, for instance, sugar is a carbohydrate, and a carbohydrate is just a collection of carbon atoms. And depending on how those carbon atoms are arranged, it's one of the main sources of finding glucose. And glucose is a simple sugar molecule that is the primary fuel that we use to fuel the mitochondria, those little organelles that live in all of our cells. But unfortunately, glucose is actually not readily available. It's usually combined with other forms of sugars. So let me give you an example. Sucrose, which most people think is plain old sugar, is half glucose and half fructose. So that white sugar, cane sugar, for instance, sucrose is half glucose and half fructose. Most fruit sugars are primarily fructose, which isn't glucose at all. And in fact, we'll talk about how fructose is incredibly damaging to almost everything in your body. There are absolutely other forms of sugars. For instance, the sugar in milk is called lactose. And some people, particularly of non-European descent, are unable to digest lactose because we no longer have the enzymes that we had as a child. So these are all forms of sugar. But the important thing to realize is modern food processing has taken the sugars that have been bound together with chemical bonds in nature to make starches. And starches are simply sugar molecules that have been bonded together in long chains. The importance of that is normally starches, because of all these chemical bonds, take quite a while to, during digestion, break these chemical bonds. Now, why is that important? Because long ago, you could eat a starch, such as, for instance, a whole grain, like rice, or a whole grain like wheat. And it would actually take a long time to break those individual starches down into glucose. But modern manufacturing has now been able to break these starch molecules into individual sugar molecules and still disguise them as starches. So what that means is a piece of bread, a plain old everyday piece of white bread, whole wheat bread, actually has the equivalent of 4 teaspoons of sugar in it, even though it doesn't taste sweet. In fact, there's so much sugar in white bread that when we calculate a glycemic index, That is, if I eat this, how much does my sugar level go up in my blood? White bread is 100. In other words, it's actually the highest rated of anything you can eat. Let me give you another example that I talked about on another podcast. A bagel has about 35 grams of sugar, even though if you read the label, you'll see 0 sugar. And that's because manufacturers have manipulated the system to hide the sugar content. So, starting with the basics, here's how I want you to look at any package that has a nutrition fact on the back. Take a look at total carbohydrates. That's the total number of sugar molecules in grams. Then you take the fiber. Fiber is that indigestible starch or sugar molecules that we personally can't digest, but our bacteria love. So you take total carbohydrates minus fiber, and that will actually give you the grams of sugar per serving. Now, grams mean nothing to most of us. So here's an easy tip. There's 4 grams of sugar in each teaspoon. So, for instance, that bagel with 33, 35 grams of sugar, divide that by 4, there's somewhere between 8 and 9 teaspoons of sugar in that bagel. Now, why is that so important? Because researchers, actually many years ago, found out how detrimental sugar was in any form to our immune system's ability to function. Now, there are actually a number of papers in humans written in the 1970s on the effect of ingestion of very different kinds of sugar, and we'll go through that real quickly, on the ability of white blood cells to actually engulf, that means eat, bacteria in this case. So what they did is they took a bunch of healthy volunteers and they gave them different forms of sugar. They gave them glucose, they gave them fructose, they gave them starch, they gave them orange juice. Now, the equivalent amount of sugar that they gave them was about the sugar in 2 cans of soda. And believe it or not, there's about 12 teaspoons in a can of soda of sugar. Now, that sugar is mostly sucrose, not glucose. What they found was they took blood from these people for 6 hours, every hour after they ingested whatever sugar they gave them. And they found with each passing hour, the ability of white blood cells to eat bacteria and kill them dramatically fell, like 70% ineffective after 1 hour of eating any of these sugars, including orange juice. And that effect lasted for about 6 hours. It gradually went back to normal. So imagine that healthy glass of orange juice you're having this morning to ward off the coronavirus is actually impairing the ability of your white blood cells, your defenders, to defend you. It literally paralyzes them. And is that really what we want to do in this time? Same way with a bagel. So a bagel is approaching a can of soda in the amount of sugar. And what's fascinating is that bagel will raise your blood sugar faster than a can of soda. It actually has a higher glycemic index. So in this day and age, the idea of eating healthy is completely perverted in terms of protecting ourselves against viruses. Now it gets even more interesting. It turns out they took then some diabetics, and they found that diabetics, their white blood cells at their basic state didn't work half as well as normal people's white blood cells. Why? Again, it was because the elevated sugar in their bloodstream suppressed the white blood cell function. Now here's the best news. If you've listened to other of my podcasts, you know that one of the only good things that came out of World War II in terms of scientific knowledge was that concentration camp survivors, fascinatingly, were immune, literally, from infections. They did not get sick. They did not get colds. Now, granted, most of these people sadly starved to death or were killed. But the survivors, the fact that they never got sick prompted scientists to investigate why starvation was good to protect you from harm in terms of bacteria and viruses. And this study was replicated in healthy volunteers, and they actually put volunteers on a 5-day water fast. And they did the same thing. They took blood each day and they looked at the ability of white blood cells to engulf bacteria and kill them. And lo and behold, with every fasting day, as blood sugar declined, the ability of white blood cells to kill bacteria increased. So if you've ever heard the expression, feed a cold and starve a fever, it turns out there's actually scientific basis for not eating or fasting to protect yourself and to actually increase the function of your immune system. Who knew? Now, I don't want everybody to go on a 5-day water fast, but the point of all this is even a 12-hour fast in these individuals was shown to improve their white blood cell function. And I got news for you. Any of us can do a 12-hour fast. Hey, you're going to do fasting for 7 to 8 hours every night. Just add on another 4 or 5 hours before you eat breakfast in the morning or eat dinner early, and you will actually increase your white blood cells' ability to defend you. And why wouldn't we want to do that? So sugars are really bad for you and bad for your immune system. And it's hidden in almost everything we eat. Now I get the question constantly, but what about natural sugar? That's got to be a lot different than cane sugar. Well, sorry. Natural sugar is no different than any other sugar. For instance, honey is still sugar. Maple syrup is still sugar. Orange juice is still sugar. So don't make the mistake that just because it's natural means it's better for you. And please don't pick up the can of soda that says all natural cane sugar or organic sugar. Sugar is sugar. This is a white substance. And if we know anything about white substances are addictive. And speaking of all natural, cocaine and heroin are all natural and they're addictive. And it turns out that the white substance sugar is equally addictive. In fact, it's actually more addictive than heroin or cocaine. How do we know? Because we can easily addict rats or mice to heroin or cocaine, and they will press a lever and get their heroin or cocaine. When we introduce them to sugar water, within 2 days, the rats will preferentially hit the button for sugar water instead of heroin or cocaine. And we now know that this actually hits the same pleasure centers in the brain that heroin and cocaine hits, but it hits it even harder. So it's no wonder that we like sugar. And it's no wonder that it's so hard for us to give it up. So think about that the next time you're craving something sweet, and think about that the next time you're trying to wean yourself off of sugar. So how about orange juice? Remember, I mentioned orange juice had the exact same effect. One of the things we have to realize, and remember, I am not against fruit in season, but season is a very short time normally. But when we take the sugar in fruit and extract all the fiber that was in fruit, and we extract all the other polyphenols that are in fruit, and just mainline sugar like apple juice or orange juice, we actually take away any of the possible benefits of that fruit and instead are literally mainlining sugar. And what we found in the last 10 years is that most of the foods that we like, the highly processed foods, the juices, the fructose in those highly processed foods are one of the biggest drivers of obesity, one of the biggest drivers of mitochondrial dysfunction, and one of the biggest drivers of a fatty liver and insulin resistance. And in my upcoming book, The Energy Paradox, you're going to find out why fructose in particular is so deadly to our mitochondria and to our health. So, fructose in the form of fruit during fruit season, okay, but just be cautious about any fructose as a sweetener in food, as a sweetener in beverages. And remember, high fructose corn syrup is in almost every prepackaged food energy bar. If you see the word corn syrup or all natural syrup or anything like that, brown rice syrup, these are all code words for fructose, and just beware.